My role in this report was almost honorific. I've learned a lot. I was on the learning curve when I worked on this report. But let me comment a little bit on the inequality of opportunity paradox that Khaled just mentioned. So you have this decrease in inequality of certain outcome and an increase in inequality of opportunity. We were discussing that. What can explain that? Of course, it has something to do with probably, we don't know, inequality between group increasing, but within group decreasing. We don't know yet. So this is a door open to future research, future investigation to try to explain what creates this particular fact. And the last sentence that I want to say is, we have this thing that international institutions have called the Arab inequality puzzle. There's no puzzle. When there are millions of people in the streets in many Arab countries, there's no puzzle there. Okay, it's like, let's go back to Émile Durkheim, who said that the suicide, from an individual perspective, it's a personal issue. If suicide rate increase or decrease in a country, then it becomes a social issue. So inequality has something to do with perception, the way people feel. And if one person feels that is being unfairly treated, then it's a personal issue. Psychologists will take care of this. But when millions of people feel that they are being unfairly treated, then there is a social issue there. And the role of researchers is not to say, this is not true. We have looked at the data set. It's not the case. Our role is to discover where this perception comes from. And this is what a first step that we intended to do in this report.
Thank you. Rasha. Thank you. So it's very difficult to talk after Khaled and Paul. So first let me start by saying I'm really glad to be part of this report. We are a big team, gender diversified and nationality diversified. We worked like for 1 year under the supervision and leadership of Khaled and Paul. We learned a lot as well. My part in this report is mainly about gender inequality. So we tackle gender inequality from different dimensions on education, health, employment, labor market, and political participation. The good news that the gender gap concerning human capital, education, and labor is almost closed. Especially in education, women are even doing better than men, especially at primary and secondary education. For health also, though we live in patriarchal society where maybe the son preference factor would be more important, but girls are more resistant concerning stunting. But this good news were not really translated into good news in labor market. We live in a region where we have the lowest female labor force participation, around 21%, and 18% of women who are in the labor market are unemployed. And when they are employed in informal sector, vulnerable without social protection, which makes women more likely to fall into poverty and suffer from a lot of issues. And this is an important issue that I think was tackled or highlighted by the report, that we need to understand why this achievement in education is not translated into labor market, what makes women not really present in several jobs and decent jobs. And I think an important part, which is related to the political economy narrative that Khaled talked about, that the public sector is not really providing decent jobs for women now, so they are more reluctant to participate in the labor market, or whenever they are obliged to do, they have to go to the informal sector. And also related to this, we have very low political participation for women. Like on average, 19% of parliament members are women, which is much lower than the world average. So as Khaled and Paul said, we just wanted to highlight the inequalities in our region, but I think this is first stage for more research and more work to be done trying to tackle the different dimensions.
Can I just say this is excellent team dynamics? It seems that the marathon carried on to give all the messages in record time. I also see our commentators sort of thinking thoroughly through every statement that was said, and I can imagine what Francisco would come and tell us, and then Danielle would tell us. So.
No, so I'd like to congratulate the team on the report. I mean, I wasn't able to read the whole report. I received it recently, and I was still reading the Banerjee and Duflo book when I received it. But from what I saw, it's very impressive, and I like the narrative very much. Let me make 5 points. And the first one actually is a reaction a little bit to something Paul just said about the Arab inequality puzzle. So when I think people were talking about the Arab inequality puzzle, I didn't come up with the term, but I've used it many times. They didn't mean there wasn't an Arab inequality problem. There clearly is an Arab inequality problem because that perception is there. The puzzle was, why are the numbers on income not explaining it? And so I think what you guys have done here is you have made a step in the direction of resolving that puzzle by pointing to this growing inequality and opportunity in access to many things. I remember 9 years ago when we were looking at inequality in opportunity in outcomes, so using income rather than access to services as the variable. So we were looking at this kind of between types inequality of opportunity rather than the dissimilarity index on many things. That wasn't very high either. I'm curious, I didn't see it. I'm curious whether you also did that exercise here. So in addition to the dissimilarity index and access to educational opportunities and so on, what's happening with the role of circumstances in determining income inequality, income or consumption inequality, which is of course a different thing. Is that also rising? Because my feeling when I looked at those papers that Raghi Assad had done some stuff on that, and Nadia Hassine also did some work on that, was that there wasn't much there either. And that again was not to say there isn't a problem. It was to say we're clearly looking in the wrong place, or we have the wrong tools to look at. In particular, one thing I wanted to, my feeling was, and I just want to ask you a question about that, is that we had the wrong circumstances. You know, so the circumstance variables, parental education, wealth, but wealth is basically not real financial wealth, right? It's something from the DHS or some, so it's not capturing the huge financial wealth of the rich, it's some sort of asset index and so on. So some of the feeling of unfairness, some of the, I think, deep frustrations that people in this region had to do with political connections, with the fact that markets were captured, business opportunities were captured by people that were rich and well connected. And those more tangible, more intangible things were not in our data sets. So there was a big inequality of opportunity that was perceived, which was not in the basic data that we were using. And so I was wondering whether, so I see what you're showing about the dissimilarity index. That goes some way already towards explaining that. But that is still the same kinds of circumstance variables. Since then, there was work that I'm aware of, including by colleagues at the bank, Bob Rikers and others, using, using firm-level data and connectivity to the Ben Ali regime in Tunisia, for example, to show that, crony capitalism was a real issue and so on. So those kinds of things are also about inequality of opportunity, but they're quite different. And I wanted to ask whether you had stuff on that. And my other points are somewhat smaller. I still think that we need, I like the multidimensional approach to the extent that incomes matter. We still need work on what we talked about this morning, and I won't go at any length about that, in understanding how the rest of the national accounts, the rest of GDP is divided, and in understanding top incomes. I was a bit shocked, for example, earlier this afternoon we had a presentation where we had a number of the Gini coefficient being 62.62, right? Being very interesting to understand, I mean, maybe you all understand, but how that's so different from the 0.33 elsewhere, right? I mean, that number, 0.62, is higher than the one that Van der Weide and Lackner, for example, have when they use this house price data to correct for the top. I don't know how it compares to what Lydia Aswad has done, But I think if it compares to what Paolo and Vladimir and others have done, that 62 is also a higher number than that. So we have these numbers floating around, and we need a better understanding of what accounts for their difference. What else do I have? A small point on multidimensionality. You know, multidimensional approaches to inequality or poverty, they can be of two kinds. They can have many marginal distributions, and look at them, or they can look at the joint distribution. And the difference between the joint distribution and just the marginal distributions is the pattern of association, or in a simpler term, correlations. You know? And so, for example, even if you look at the famous Alkire and Foster measure of multidimensional poverty, a rank correlation increasing switch is the term for this. So when you take two deprivations and you make the, you know, so Danielle and I, you know, he's deprived in X, but not in Y. Or sorry, he's deprived a lot in X and a little in Y. I'm deprived a lot in Y and a little in X. That's society, and then we swap so that he's deprived a little in X and Y, and I'm deprived a lot in X and Y. You see, if those deprivations didn't cross the poverty lines, Alkire and Foster index won't change if there wasn't a crossing. And yet most people feel that by concentrating the deprivations in one person, you've made the society worse with this transfer. That you can only see if you look at the joint distribution rather than the marginals. And I was wondering whether that's something that you were able to address here or not. I know that Paul knows this stuff very well, so he'll be able to. One small question and then my final point. So the small question is, you showed this rising years of schooling pattern, Khalid, here, the progress in human development, the rising in years of schooling. Earlier we had a paper that showed a big decline in years of schooling for Egypt. A very big decline, particularly if you think that these are stocks. These are labor force. Danielle and I were talking about those numbers in that study. I mean, where does that come from? Yeah.
It was declining, it was quartile.
It was across. So we can come back to that. But my point is, again, much as in the 0.62 number that really puzzled me earlier, there are some numbers, some things that come out that just don't talk to the rest of the conversation. So there's a lot that we need to figure out. And then my last point is, on the political economy story which you make, I think that, you know, this idea of leaving the inequality trap that you're talking about is the challenge. And in particular, in economies that are rents-based, as the MENA economies are, I think the key issue around the social contract, and everyone in this room knows more about this than I, so I'm just phrase it as a question. But it seems to me that the sort of social contract that was set up in many countries in this region was, we have these rents, and we are going to redistribute them in two ways. We're going to redistribute them through government jobs, which are going to be fairly high paying, and we're going to redistribute them through price subsidies. Both of those turned out to be terrible ways to redistribute. And the best way to redistribute would probably be to create something like the Alaskans and the Norwegians have done, you know, which is a sort of universal basic income based on those resource rents. Now, is that a banner that anyone's taken up? Is that feasible? Is that just going to be laughed out of the room as a ridiculous idea in this region? You know, is there a debate in that direction? So I'll end with that.
After a whole day of numbers, this report was really like a breath of oxygen. I really liked, and here you can read bellissimo as a comment. And let me quote in the final pages, so it's disguised and in the almost conclusion. They say, this low personal autonomy is intrinsically linked to inequality, as the rentier social contract is in essence based on the exchange of high per capita rents for low accountability and transparencies, low political participation and regime legitimacy. I think that this key of reading the report is a very courageous, first of all, and also very is a nice key of reading result. So I will take this lead in commenting on some of the result of the paper. The first is you prove that there is a rise in educational attainment while inequality of opportunity is not declining. And you mentioned the issue of the low quality of education, but you do not provide policy advice in any direction, because that's not easy. You quote the extent of private tutoring, but then the problem is what can be the public answer to this problem. And one issue that comes from the European debate, and which can maybe possibly introduce also here, is the issue of school autonomy. I don't know anything about the educational system here, but I get the feeling that the system is rather uniform and the autonomy of the teacher is fully limited. In a sense, using the economist jargon, this is a limitation of competition, if you wish, because as long as you decentralize the educational system up to a certain degree, then you can create some sort of competition among schools which can be adaptable to the different situations, which probably can increase what you aim for, the personal autonomy. Because going back to the puzzle was created by aspiration unmatched by reality, but these aspirations were probably unrelated to the real possibility, and these make it even more frustrating. So if you can create from start a sort of channeling aspiration of the students, later on future workers, in a direction that is compatible with the emergence of the best one, that is probably one possibility. The second suggestion, which comes from reading your report, I don't know whether you do agree or not, is that you underline that most of the public intervention is the provision of public employment. And there is no clear understanding on how this public employment is distributed. You mentioned several times the cronyism as one way of getting this employment. So I do expect that probably a reform of the public administration at the entry level, I don't mention the top level, but suppose you can allocate a fraction of the public employment according to the educational result. I know I'm dreaming, but that could be a way of creating a legitimacy in the process, which probably drive the aspiration of the student, then worker, that there is at least one way of getting out. Related to this proposition, you mentioned correctly the idea of promoting the entrepreneurship even at the low level, which is true, but it's easy to answer that if you go in the street, you get a lot of potential entrepreneurs which are basically self-employed and unable to reach a sufficient threshold of level of activity. I don't know whether promoting co-ops among the workers may be a way to help them to express and to organize this entrepreneurial effort. In many cases, it's not entrepreneurship, it's just the only way left to do some activity. But again, what is among the lines of your report is that there is a lack of competition in this society. not always competition is the right solution. Competition brings in additional inequality, but apparently you need some shock, or this is my reading of your analysis. You need some shock in order to break the ties. Otherwise, I don't see from your report other way out, because the amount of resources which are distributable are limited by the low level of taxation. And so the only way to find a way towards a more fair society, and not saying a more equal society, is to distribute in a more fair way what is already available.
Do the authors want to get back to the commentaries, or do we have questions from the floor? Any particular issues that, yeah. Okay, I have a question actually. And it's more to do, you do have, okay, Shahir.
Yes. I haven't read the report yet, but I mean, it's very encouraging to start reading it. And I have a question for Khaled, perhaps, given that you are talking about the political economy story behind the inequalities that you're measuring. And I was wondering whether you were able to examine the effect of both economic and political institutions on inequality. Because, for instance, we can have something similar to I don't know, like time to trade or time to start business, all these institutional impediments, but especially at the economic level, more than governance, voice and accountability and such measures. So to what extent did you tackle the dimension of economic institutions and their impact on inequality in the report? And if yes, how, and if no, perhaps, I mean, does this make sense, and is it likely to have an effect on inequality? Thank you.
Okay, so let me answer Shahir's question first, because that's an easy one. No, we haven't. I mean, to do that would be an interesting exercise. What we've done is basically we've correlated between the quality of governance using the World Bank indicator database. So we've normalized it 0 to 1, Kaufman indicators, taking the political instability as our dependent variable and looked at the relationship, and we found a very nice linear negative relationship. So political stability and governance, lack of governance. And extrapolating from that, you can see that a lot of the region, many countries in the region have had deteriorating governance with rising conflict and deteriorating quality of institutions. Now, how does the inequality come into play with that? And that, of course, depends on what kind of inequality you're talking about. And that's a different research project, because we're dealing here with macro data, not micro data. And it's very difficult for then you to find ways of combining that. It's not impossible. We've been trying to answer some of these questions with the enterprise surveys, looking at some of the key variables and answering one central question, which goes back to the solutions part. Because essentially, the jobs that are realistically we're looking at, the jobs of the future are not going to be created in the public sector. I don't want to get into the debate on whether or not we have already a bloated public sector, but most people would argue that it's also quite a lot of redundancies and inefficiencies for various reasons. But the problem is that your formal private sector has not been creating jobs as you would expect. You have had jobs created, but mainly in low value added service sectors. Yes, agriculture has been sort of your surplus labor, W. Arthur Lewis style depository that has been exporting, but the share is going down, and that's not going to continue on forever. But they haven't been moving to these, other high value or medium even value added sectors. So that's the key issue. Why isn't the private sector creating jobs? Because a lot of the issues about the inequalities and the mismatch between what is happening on human capital investments and the ability to capitalize on that investment is because of that, because of the lack of a structured transformation process. And that goes back to the political economy narrative. Why is this happening? Why is it that we have, is it because of a Dutch disease? Well, what's putting that in place? So I think that the rentier political economy narrative is still alive, but it's dwindling. It's dwindling simply because there aren't that many rents as compared to the early 2000s. But it's not over yet. And going back to Francesco's point about the universal basic income, actually we had a debate about that. And I'm one of the supporters of that. I think that as an alternative to the existing system, it would be much better. But I don't think that that would be the panacea. I think that you would have to also take into account intergenerational qualities associated with that. So you'd have to also look at what other countries, Scandinavian countries, have done in terms of having this generational wealth fund to keep. I mean, you'd have to also put aside for the current expenses with the demographic youth bulge that we have. So it's a tricky issue. But anyways, I don't want to linger on too much on this issue. I think basically the main story that we're trying to say in this report is that whereas once we're basically focused on one dimension of inequality, now we're trying to explain it in terms of a systems approach, in terms of looking at the nexus between human capital investment, which we can see something good has happened in, okay? Quantitative, not quality-wise. Quality is another issue. So there has been an investment in human capital. Now, if you go to human capital endogenous growth models, it will tell you that growth is supposed to follow, right? That didn't happen. It didn't happen because the link between them in terms of decent employment wasn't doing its job, okay? And if that doesn't happen, and you don't get this growth in sustainable growth with a structured transformation process, you're going to have this gap between what's happening to household incomes and the economy growing. And that's also going to put pressure on the middle class, and it's going to put pressure on your poverty and vulnerability, as in the case of Egypt. So you're not going to find the fiscal space to continue on the cycle of investment in human capital. So even your quantitative gains in the future may come under threat. So you need to figure out a way to make that cycle work. And that's the main message of the report. And in the process, if you do that, you're going to fix that paradox between inequality of outcomes and inequality in opportunities.
I want to have one closing question, if we don't have anything else from the floor. Right. There's always a challenge from wearing my communications and policy outreach hat. There's always a challenge to say, great findings. Again, where does that leave us? What does that mean in terms of policy recommendations? And I have a feeling that I started this morning, and I've always loved data because it always, every time I heard data, I thought, ooh, I'm getting a map. I know exactly where I'm going. Today, at the end of the day, I'm going like, it feels more like traffic lights. You know, you see green and then, careful, it's actually going into yellow. If you take that on board, it's going to go into red. And if you look at it differently, you might try and take a right turn and find another set of traffic sets. So, so my question is, at the research and policy nexus, from the report, what is the report able to provide for some clear policy recommendations? So that's one question. And at the nexus of what we're talking about this morning, and then zooming in on the region, is there something from the global wisdom that we need to be aware of for the region as we embark on having our first narrative that would allow us to build upon in the future. So if I can have the authors tell us about any clear policy recommendations at this stage, or is it something that's still work in progress? And then perhaps we can hear from Danielle and Francisco about the global aspect.
I'm not sure we have, I mean, at least for gender, but I think it highlights important thing that policymakers, if they want to increase female participation in labor market, I mean, we should think about something different than increasing education, because this is already done. And we think we need to think about something different than public sector, because as Khaled said, we're not really getting more jobs in public sector. So I think we need kind of decent jobs in the private sector that respects the double burden of women. The fact that they're not only breadwinners, they're only caregiver. From government perspective, I think we need more social policies that take into consideration that women who go to work need more nurseries and daycares to take care of their children. So I mean, if we send one message to policymakers concerning gender and to increase women's participation in labor market, because I mean, I think we all agree and the literature agree on the importance of this for the development and the growth process. We need to think in a different way, accepting the fact that women are playing the double role.
Okay, so this is the tough question, right? What to do? Well, there are three things that I would emphasize. One is that there needs to be a commitment, a recommitment to social policy outcomes. And you can call that a call for a new deal, a new social contract, but the commitment to the role of the state to provide quality public service, particularly as we've seen in this region with a complete deterioration, if not collapse in some countries, of that function. Okay? So the role of the state has to be redefined. And it's essential that it continues to provide health and education, not in the way that we're seeing it in many countries, but actually quality health and education service. The people of this region deserve that. Otherwise, we're going to continue on with these trends of very high and unsustainable out-of-pocket expenditures, which are hurting not just the middle class, but the vulnerable, the lower groups as well. So that's our first key recommendation. Whatever happens, that commitment needs to be there. Now, how do you do that? Well, you have to increase the fiscal space. And it's not going to come from rents. It has to come from somewhere else. And where is that going to, what is that going to be? So that's where you get into the fiscal policy debate. To get into the fiscal policy debate, you also need to know what we're talking about here. So one of the first things we need to do is to increase transparency, open budget initiatives. We need to figure out, answers to these questions. And that might come with some radical proposals, like, for example, making it compulsory for people to report on their incomes. I mean, it's another dream, but if it does happen, I know that many people will say that, this might scare off investors, it might not be practical for whatever reasons, but really it's a very important first step for us to be able to assess the size of the fiscal space available that we can then debate on how to assign it. And even including the optimum tax rate. I'm not saying that you can increase. In fact, you might even lower the tax rate. But the important issue is for you to begin to have that debate. And I think in many countries where this debate has taken place, and when there is a political will not just to build infrastructure, which is important, but to transform economies. And I think right now, many countries in the region, everybody would agree, are in a balance of payments constraint. That's the thing that really bothers the economic decision makers. Well, transform the countries to be exporting in orientation. And we have opportunities. We have we have the investment in human capital. We have the geographical location. You have the know-how. You have, a region that, according to our research, if you integrate, there are enormous multipliers. I mean, a lot of our colleagues in the modeling department have found that, you know, with just reducing the transport costs would have significant multiplier effects, and you know, that's, so there are means available, but it has to be, all of these things are contingent upon the third and most important and crucial of all policy recommendations, which is institutional reform. And of course that needs to be unpacked. And I think here's where the ERF and the role of the ERF is very important, because there has been a lot of work done, and especially on the nexus between institutional governance reforms and conflict, and what do we mean by that? And I think that's the direction of the future, because it's not like we have this blanket, you know, one size or one policy, and because each country, I mean, what applies for the Gulf definitely doesn't apply for Sudan today, and I know Ibrahim is facing a lot of challenges in trying to solve the fiscal space problem there, and it doesn't apply to Egypt, doesn't apply to Maghreb. So there's a lot of work to be done. My hope is that this would not be the first, the last report. I think it would be important for us to consider that this initiative becomes done on a regular basis, because I think what we have here is more questions that still need to be answered, and hopefully our partnership would continue, and we continue on this stream of work. So that's my 2 cents, basically.
I will not speak a lot. I would just say a naive thing for this guy who comes from Canada. So I was on this learning curve, and at some point, I just asked myself, what is the main policy recommendation of all these things? And it's essentially, in most of the case, you ask those who make policy, those policymakers, to get themselves out of business. So it's, I don't know. Yeah, it's as simple as that. So it's difficult to see the policy relevance when the people you're talking to are the main source of the problem.
No, I don't have anything to add.
I think global wisdom has to come from you, Daniele. But I'll say 2 things very, very quickly in response to your question. I actually, and I want to emphasize, I think actually those are the questions facing this region and the questions facing many other regions, or for example, the United States, to be specific, are actually not that dissimilar in 2 ways. One, this data question that we had this morning that I think we still have. So we've all worked on different techniques. I think this multidimensional approach that you guys have is fabulous. We all worked on inequality of opportunity. But in the end, when we go back to the basic question of what is the distribution of income or consumption like, it turns out we're very unhappy with the answers we have. We don't know if the Gini in Egypt is 31 or 62. That's not... Okay, okay. Maybe we do know, but I don't know, and it's, you know, and I've seen both numbers, and we don't know what's happening with the top in many places. Now that's in the US, that's what motivated the Piketty and Size work. But around the world, we have very few. I mean, remember I showed you there were 31 countries that overlap between the WID database and our database, right? So these are questions that are plaguing. We're back to the household surveys that we always thought were the fundamental instrument for our analysis of income distribution turned out to be missing a lot. And so that's a big question on the data front. And it's a global question that's dominating the debate on this. And I think it's a question here too, so similar in that way. And on the policy thing, I mean, I think Khaled spoke much more eloquently than I could about this, but I do think that it goes back a lot in this region to the redistribution of rents and the social contract around redistribution of rents, and then if there are big inequalities in income from capital and labor, whether that should be taxed as well. And once again, that very much echoes the debate, not so much in Europe, where, as we saw from Francesco's presentation, they are able to raise 40 to 45% of GDP, of national income in taxes. But in the US, there's a much more widespread feeling now than I ever thought I would see that they tax too little. I mean, the balance of view in the US is still that you should always have lower taxes. But there's now almost half of the population who say, actually, we should tax more. And look, we used to tax at 90% at the top, and now we tax at 27% at the top. And some of that is also rent, even though the US is, well, it is actually a big oil producer. But we don't think of it as an oil economy. But there's this whole debate about concentrating market power in big industries. There's literature on, you know, rising monopoly profits in the United States, which may be a similar thing. It's about taxing rents and redistributing them. So I would highlight these two areas are areas where the global, or at least American debate right now are very similar to the ones in this area.
I think I'll just thank you very much for the panelists. I will give you the floor for one minute.
Just mentioned several times about the Gini coefficient being high, and I started this debate, or shall we say in Arabic, fitna, you know, like, but, you know, let me just answer it provocatively. Does it matter? You know, I mean, this obsession with the Gini coefficients, the returns to education, the education variables, you know, from someone who worked with the data, I would tell you the answer is, you know, unfortunately, if you torture the data long enough, it shall confess. I mean, you know, and I was intrigued by Vladimir's presentation when just, you know, slightly different ways of treating outliers, you know, zero and negative, which people just cut off, you know. And if we treat it differently, it can completely change those numbers. Now, I'll tell you, you know, why we got a high Gini coefficient from the ELMPS. I looked at the working paper, and the reason is just the way we measured the income. You know, it's non-labor income. I put it in my notes here. Doesn't want to open, but basically, we also included, you know, first before transfers, we looked at enterprise, you know, household enterprise earnings. We included those. We included rents. We included in the transfers social protection, social insurance, as well as remittances, right? So whatever the data sets, you know, allow you to have. So you're able to incorporate all those. And of course, once you incorporate so many other non-typical entrants into income that you couldn't measure before, you're able to capture a lot of inequality. So that's why, you know, we have that. It might not be comparable, it's not harmonized, but it shows that. But what I mean is, you know, I was inspired by you saying you were reading a book you didn't want to leave, you know, Duflo's, and it's Poor Economics, right? Duflo, the new one, okay. Okay, Good Economics for Hard Times. But of course, you know, their idea, and this is, you know, what I would say, this is my takeaway as someone who, you know, kind of near retirement age, with policy, you know, we really need to leave the offices. I mean, we need to leave, you know, this is what the Nobel Prize laureates, you know, have come up with, that you need to leave the office, go to the field, and really, I mean, if they feel inequality, you know, the participants in the market, then there is inequality. We just need to, you know, really quantify it in a better way, using randomized controlled trials, using proper methodologies, and then when we suggest policies, then we need to study them well. And that needs a completely different type of investment besides our normal data set. Maybe this is something for ERF to consider, bringing a lot of funding into randomized controlled trials.
Thank you. Thank you for the added task now. I think we did some excellent timing, and I'm really, really grateful for the input and for a fantastic panel. And congratulations on the report. As you say, it's just the beginning. So I can see a lot of lights going on and off at the moment. So really good luck with what's to come. And thank you for each and every one of you, for the authors, for the commentators, for the role play that's been done all day today. Fantastic contribution. I thank you for your participation as well. And we'll be having all the material online as well at some point, very close. And we'll send that out very shortly. Thank you again. And